Um, Welcome, good afternoon. My name is Joanna Niewicka. I'm director of the Polish Studies Center, and on behalf of the Polish Studies Center and my colleagues from Russia and East European Institute who are co-sponsoring with us this lecture, I would like to welcome you to Mikołaj Herbst lecture on persistent legacy of the fallen empires. When I was inviting Mikołaj to give this lecture, I had two things in mind which I thought would be important for us. First thing, we tend to think about education in short terms, right? We don't have this perspective of long duration. But when I say we, I mea culpa. I think people who do literature, cultural studies, even social studies. When we discuss educational reforms in Poland, right now we have this huge debate, we go back maybe to the beginning of post-communist period, namely 1989. Sometimes people talk a little bit further in the past, and they talk about the end of the World War II as being kind of a big shift in educational programs. But very rarely scholars talk about lingering effects of the very distant past, or what seems to us a very distant past. And in this case, in case of Poland, it's the history and memory of partitions that lasted from 1795 to 1918, so 123 years when educational system was under the colonizing powers. We don't think about it, and I think it is crucial, really essential for any kind of humanistic and social inquiry to think about long-term cultural impact of very distant past on our culture. And on our culture, what really transmits our culture most, actually education. I work in memory studies, I study collective memory, and I realized that in order to study collective memory, I really need to go back to what is taught at school, to programs, to textbooks, curricula, because this is really what transmits many of the cultural phenomena that we then take as kind of in their fully shaped form already by the kind of acting agent of the active political society. So just going back to the question of really deeply and broadly understood education, I think is very, very important. So it was, to me, a great opportunity and a great pleasure to be able to invite Mikołaj Herbst to give us a lecture on persistent legacy of the fallen empires and assessing really how this distant past works, impacts social norms towards education. So let me just tell you a few words about Mikołaj. Mikołaj is an associate professor at the University of Warsaw, Center for European, Regional and Local Studies, and he's specializing in education economics, human capital and regional development. He was a member of the Strategic Advisors Unit appointed by the Prime Minister of Poland from 2007-2009. And he actually worked as an education advisor not only in Poland but also in Ukraine, Montenegro and Bulgaria. And in his research project, what I found particularly attractive was really interdisciplinary and international dimension of his thinking about education. He published numerous articles and several books, but let me just give you some of his titles to give you an idea about his interests. So, for instance, this most, relatively recent, right, or most recent article, book chapter, right, published by Routledge in 2019, on interdisciplinary approaches to the persistent effects of Polish partitions. I imagine this will be related to your lecture, but also common legacy, different paths, the transformation of educational systems in the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, and Poland, divergent historical experiences and inequality in academic achievement, the case of Poland. Early effects of an early start, evidence from lowering the school starting age in Poland. Education as a factor and outcome of regional development, experience of Poland in international perspective. and so on and so on. So we really would like to get enlightened from you on this, on this topic, and I hope we'll have a good interdisciplinary conversation afterwards. Welcome, Mikołaj. Mikołaj is here, I'm sorry just to say, on the exchange. It's a ministry program, right? The Polish ministry program, and he is working on, how should we call it, self-selection of teachers, namely what decisions contribute to teachers' decision to become teachers, right?
Yeah.
Is the best way to put it?
I think so. Yeah.
All right, wonderful, welcome.
Thank you very much for this very kind invitation and for the opportunity to share my research with you. Well, I think you almost stole my first slide, but it's. I think I don't have to convince you that history matters. Not in this place, not among you. I think we all are aware that what you observe today in terms of social, economic, political phenomena has roots in the past. So it's impossible to understand the contemporary reality without referring to the past and to the differences between places, regions, cities that have their roots in the deep past. And hence the concept of path dependency in social sciences that says that the differences between places that we observe right now are really caused by the, or to much extent are caused by the phenomena that took place in the past, and it's impossible to research one without the other. There have been some famous works on how history affects the present. Probably the most known, and also the most known in an interdisciplinary society, is the one by Robert Putnam on the effect of this different status of different cities in Italy in the Middle Ages, their autonomy on the quality and amounts of social capital in the present. By the way, this research was somehow repeated or by the international team in 2016 using more formalized method, and almost all of the findings were confirmed. So even in such a long time span, this historical events, historical institutions have effect on the phenomena that are observed today. There are different strands in this socio-economic or social science literature on the effects on history on the present. There are lots of studies referring to the roots of European superpowers and trying to explain, to better understand why some European countries have developed as very strong economies and societies, while others have not. And the work by Acemoglu and the team is one of the most prominent. Another strand is devoted to the colonial legacy in Africa and Asia. So these studies tend to try to establish how different experience rule of British or French or other countries in these areas of the world have influence on the contemporary levels of development and other social issues. They also find that depending on whether the rule was French, British, or other, these development paths were really divergent. Finally, there is an important part of literature that is devoted to migration, and how the experience of migration and how the origin affects social norms, affects the behaviors of people that are living now in different countries. Like this is also an American experience, not very much Polish one, but American experience of people from different origins living in this country and still sharing the norms or have some behaviors that are typical for these countries where they originate from, rather than for the country they live in, sometimes for many generations. So this also has been documented in many empirical research studies. I hope you will not be terribly offended if I remind you some facts about from Polish history, because I assume not all of you are aware of the partitions and what they really meant to this part of Europe. So Poland was a big European country in the end of 18th century, but it was between 1772 and 1795. It became divided between the three neighboring superpowers. Completely divided in a sense that in 1795 it ceased to exist on the map of Europe, and it only regained its independence after the end of the First World War in 1918. So these partitions took place in three phases: 1772, 1793, and 1795. And of course, there were different transitional periods in terms of some institutional forms of the Polish state existed in the 19th century, but it was not independent. They were subordinated to the superpowers. So overall, it lasted 123 years between the loss of independence and regaining it. And most importantly for this research and for our talk today, is that 19th century, when Poland was not existent, was a very important century in the formation of modern societies and countries. So it was the age of urbanization, it was the age of industrialization, age in which middle class really emerged and became important for the society. And last but not least, the age in which public education systems were formed, because they mostly didn't exist before. So the compulsory public education system in all three partitions, it means all the territory of Poland, were established in the 19th century, but in a very different way. And because the countries that were the superpowers that were occupying Poland at the time had a very different attitude towards education, were very different states, have very different goals on these territories of partitions. Just to give you one fact about how different the situation was, there was 100 years gap between the introduction of compulsory schooling in Poland under the Prussian rule and the Russian rule. So the compulsory schooling was introduced under the Prussian, whole Prussia, in 1817, and it was only introduced on the Russian territory in 1917, and Poland was in 1918 after regaining the independence. So this gives you the image how different the situation was in terms of education. But it was not only this. I mean, the partitions were very different in terms of levels of cultural autonomy. the Austrian partition, the so-called region of Galicia, was had the most autonomy in terms of experiencing their local culture, using own language, Polish language in this case. Polish language was mostly used as language of instruction in the Galician schools, which was not the case in Prussia, neither Prussia nor Russia. Galicia, the southern territory, the territory under the Austrian rule, were the only one to develop universities at this territory. There were two big universities, one in Krakow, another one in Lviv. While there was only one university in Warsaw, established in 1816, which didn't even exist for most of the part of the partition period. Finally, which is very much pronounced in every discussion about the quality of education, the status of teachers and the origin, the recruitment of teachers, procedures were very different in the three partitions, because in Galicia, in the Austrian partition, many teachers were Polish, and they were also coming from popular class. Well, so there was a possibility of social advancement through working at school. In both Prussian and Russian, since the language of instruction was Russian and Prussian respectively, and German respectively, then most of the teachers were not Polish, and to much extent in these areas, in these regions, school was perceived as a tool of decolonization in terms of introducing different culture to this territory, rather than raising the quality of human capital or skills among people. So, to put it on a map, I think it's going to be easier to look at the map. This is the territory of today's Poland, which is a bit different than the 18th century Poland, of course. I would say it's much different, but since we're discussing the quality of education in contemporary Poland, we will stick to the contemporary map. And it is divided into municipalities. Today's municipalities. There are almost 2,500 municipalities in Poland, and the thick lines are the borders of the partitions, historical borders. They don't exist anymore for 100 years. But we'll be interested in the Russian partition, which is this part, the Austrian partition, which is this part, Galicia, the Prussian partition, which is this part. And the two other parts are not of our interest, because these are territories that are acquired by Poland from Germany after the World War II. And it were not Polish before the end of the World War, so naturally they are not subject of partitions. Okay, so I hope this image is quite clear. The problem is that in contemporary Poland, we didn't even know what are the territorial differences in the quality of education, because until 2002, all the tests at schools were taken locally and were graded locally. So it depended on schools or the grading system, on the quality or how they approach this problem. What the average, of course, there were some standards to which the schools grading standards to which the schools should stick, but still, these were not very reliable data. And it all changed in 2002 when Poland, for the first time, introduced the standardized tests for the whole country. So in 2002, we saw this. these are the results of the first test in the middle school, the math science test in 2002. And what could be immediately seen that the average results, of course, the darker are better. Yeah? So the average scores are much higher in the former Austrian partition and the former Russian partition, and they're surprisingly weak in the western part of the country. Which is surprising because, you know, most of the indicators that we look in Poland, socioeconomic indicators, are always better in the West, because West is more developed in terms of economy. So we are observing this map, this territorial distribution of educational quality for years, and it's been changing a bit. So if you look at the scores from 2013, the pattern is not that clear. Still, the former Austrian partition is got high scores. It's not so clear about the difference between the Russian and the Prussian, the former Russian and the former Prussian partition. So we needed some tools to understand whether we really have, we really observe some effect of historical, events, historical divisions on the contemporary quality of education, or we just think so because it's an easy, like, association and tool to understand things. So there are really two questions. First, whether there's a difference in the quality of education, persistent difference in the quality of education, in the achievements between different partitions. And the other one is, what, if yes, then what is the channel? What is, why is that? What makes this difference? Now I need to make some methodological introduction, because economists do research on social issues probably in a different way that most of you are familiar with, because we are a bit obsessed about distinguishing the causal effect from some confounding factors. So we want to understand whether what we observe is caused by the problem we are interested in, or some other factors that are happening at the same time. And in terms of education, it's easy to understand that it may be the case. Like, for example, the differences between regions in the quality of education may not be caused by some historical events and norms that they were shaped during the partitions, but maybe just because one region is richer than the other and spending more on education. Yes, and so distinguishing this causal from non-causal relationship is very important in economic research on education. And the tools economists use very frequently is this tool is called natural experiment. Natural experiment is the experiment that was not really designed as experiment, but it happened, and can be reinterpreted as such, as experiment. To give you some examples from the papers that were published, one very common subject in the economics of education is how is whether schooling brings effects, whether going to school more makes you better makes your achievements at school better. But we have a problem, because people who go to school more frequently, go more years or more days in the year to school, are not chosen randomly. Yeah, maybe they have more educated parents and they care about schools. So this is this exact problem of confounding the causal relationship with non-causal relationship. So the natural experiment that was used by Marcotte in 2007 he called it a mother natural experiment. So he picked one state in the United States. I can't remember which state it was, but it was in the north because snowing was the factor. So rather than looking at the people who spend more days, students who spend more days at school, comparing to those who spend less days in schools, he focused on the different years in terms of the amount of snowing in these years, because snowing prevent all students from going to school. And he checked whether scores are systematically higher in the years in which there were less snow. And it was so. So in that way he proved that there is an effect of schooling on the achievements, not referring directly to the number of days people choose to go to spend at school. Yeah, another example is more related to what I will show in terms of my research. It uses the natural experiment tool that is called regression discontinuity design. You probably know that regression analysis is a statistical tool used by social scientists to capture some causal relationship, but this discontinuity refers precisely to distinguishing the causal from non-causal effect, because it's another research from a paper that is trying to establish whether going to better schools makes you more successful than going to worse schools. And this is the example from a study on Romanian schools, in which the admission to good schools is based on some test results from the previous level. Of course, better students got better scores, so maybe they are better off in their life, not because they went to better schools, but because they have better skills from the beginning. But what the researchers did here is they focused on the very narrow group of students that were very close in terms of the achievements in the middle school, and compared just those who were just above the threshold and those who were below the threshold in terms of getting to good school. So they had very similar skills at the age of 15. Like there were maybe 1 or 2 points difference. But because of that 1 or 2 points difference, they went to different schools. Yeah? And this is this discontinuity. They're almost the same. They're almost the same quality at the age of 15, but just because of 1 point of the scores, they were assigned to different schools. And here the authors proved that because of that, they had much more, the achievements in the further education, which were much more divergent. Okay, so this is the discontinuity idea. But here, we are not talking about discontinuity in scores, but really a discontinuity in space. Because we're talking about physical borders. Non-existent borders, but still borders. And hence the concept of geographical regression discontinuity. So, in a similar way that we can speak about people approaching to the threshold from both sides in terms of achievements, like 1 point difference in the test scores, we can say of people approaching from the threshold in a geographical sense, being very close to the border, but one student goes to the school at left side of the border and the other on the right side of the border. And this is the idea of geographical regression discontinuity design, which was in the very same context as my research, used first by Bukowski. And this part of my research is really replicating this result, but I'm going further in terms of asking why is the difference. So to illustrate, just a second. All right. So, this is the map of Poland again, and the dots here are the schools. Middle schools in 2015. All middle schools in 2015 in Poland. And the red dots are located in the former Russian partition, and the blue dots are in the former Austrian partition. So what I really do, I try to focus on the border as close as I can. So I may look at the schools that are just 10 kilometers from the border. Because we assume that in terms of settlement, in terms of people who live there, these places are very similar. What is different is this historical origin of which some of these people don't know. They just live there. So in fact, what I really did is it was the 50 kilometers because I wanted to have more schools in my south. Okay, so by limiting to myself to this bandwidth of 50 kilometers, after doing this, I do the regression analysis, which I'm not introduced to you because it doesn't make sense. It's just a statistical tool to research, but I will give you graphical interpretation of the result. Which is here. So again, dots are schools. So, and the position of the school represents the average test score in this school in 2015. The distance from the border is measured on the horizontal axis. And here we are in the former Austrian partition. And we are approaching the border to the former Russian partition. Here is the same graph, but for former Prussian-Russian border. And the line represents the expected average outcome from this test, from this middle school math science test. So what we can see is that there is a visible difference in the average achievement in the Austrian versus former Russian partition, and there is no difference between the former Prussian and Russian border. Which is exactly what Bukowski found also. But he was doing it on a level of average municipal scores, not school scores. But the outcome was very similar. So we got a confirmation that there is a persistent difference between the former Austrian partition and Russian partition. No difference between Prussian and Russian one. So not very much in line of this fact with this gap in introduction of compulsory schooling. You remember that compulsory schooling was first introduced in the Prussian partition. In which the average score is low. So there has to be different, there has to be another explanation for this. And what we suspect is that this channel that is explaining the better performance of the former Austrian partition schools is are the norms towards education. So let us remind that there were different facts that lead us to this track. First, there was instruction in Polish, which develops different kind of norm towards school than if the instruction is obligatorily in a foreign language. There's cultural autonomy. There was a possibility for social advancement through education and also through becoming a teacher for the lower class people in Galicia, in the Austrian partition, which was very difficult or impossible in the other partitions. there are universities, but there's also there's a convention when you speak about educational experts in Poland, which is not proven, at least in a quantitative way, that schools in the south of Poland, which is the former Galicia, care more about the formative part of education than about preparing, about people learning different skills that are used in life. So the school is treated in a different way. It's more about shaping the personalities, shaping the people, and less about endowing them with the necessary skills to survive and to live in the labor market. So, but these are just convictions. So we tried to test it. We did a self-design survey of parents. Students of the middle school attending second or third grade of middle school, 2,500 parents were picked, or schools were picked. I must say, schools were picked for the analysis in all three former partitions. They were picked randomly, using some liars, so that they were representative for the given partition. And each of the randomly picked schools, 10 parents were interviewed. So, based on this interview, the interview was based to identify some norms towards education, and then these norms were aggregated into bigger norms. So the three major norms to which the items were aggregated were the returns to education. So what people think, what parents think about returns to education. That's the payoff to be educated, and in what sense it pays off. So there were issues like schools, treating schools as investment, whether education is the determinant of success, what do you think about the plans of educational career of your children, do they have to go to university or not, how do you perceive the wage of the professor compared to the people with lower education, and so on and so on. Will you be willing to pay for education if there is a necessity to pay for education? Because I should have, maybe not clear for people in the States, but all this research was done in public schools, which are free. Okay, the second norm that we will investigate is the formative role of school. So the questions we asked was about the subjects to focus on, because it's very difficult for the student to focus on all subjects. So what are the most important subjects for you, for the parents, as a parent? So whether it's rather history and Polish language, or maybe it's math and some more practical. What is more important, directly, ask it directly, what is more important for you? That formation of training skills at school. Whether school needs to teach patriotism, tolerance, critical thinking, so values of very different kind, but they're all values. Yeah. So, or whether it should focus on training in skills. And finally, the third norm was the trust in school and educators. Opinion on teachers, on the wages also, whether they are illegal to society or maybe losers. What do you think about school autonomy? And so on. So we combined these different items into the three big norms. So this is the way we did it. The first one was perceiving education, returns to education as high. expressing trust in educational institutions, and recognizing the formative role of education. Okay, and then we run a logistic regression. So I just show the formula, but the general idea is that we check in what way different characteristics of the people, of the parents, including their individual characteristics like the age, their own education level, their migration experience, different things we ask for, but also the place they live, the former partition they live, shape the attitude towards those three norms. And here are results. So the numbers here are the probabilities, the assessed probabilities of sharing particular norm. Yeah? So the first norm, we perceive returns to education as high. The second norm, the priority to, we give priority to formative education. And finally, we trust in educational institutions. So, here the probabilities for Austrian partitions and the probabilities for non-Austrian partitions. Because we found no difference between the Prussian and Russian partitions, we combined them into one, and we compared it to Austrian partition. Finally, the last line is the difference, just the difference between the probabilities. Yeah, so this is this minus this. And probably it's best to focus on this last line. So what we can see that there's visibly much more trust in education institutions in the Austrian partition. Right? There's 10 percentage point difference in the probability of declaring trust in educational institutions. It's not just declaring trust because we combine these different items. Yes, maybe it's declaring, but in different ways. Yes. There is also some difference, like almost 7 percentage points in favor of former Austrian partition in giving priority to formative role of education. But quite surprisingly, there are less people convinced that education gives you something material. So we got the confirmation that the attitude towards education is in fact different in this former Austrian partition, in a sense that we trust them more, and we think that it's important for the formation of the personality of our kids, but we don't really think it's important for achieving, or we think it less than compared to other former partitions. That it's important to our material success, and it yields measurable returns. So here's the same results, but in graphical form. It's just the same. So the triangle here that represents the three different norms. Here we split it. We did Austrian versus Prussian and Austrian versus Russian partition. You can see that these pictures are almost the same. So there's no really difference between the attitudes towards education in the former Prussian versus Russian partition. But there is indeed difference between the Austrian part and the rest. Yeah, so going to the summary. So what we found, first of all, we have done this here, we confirmed that there is a difference in average test scores between the partitions, and this difference is visible, takes place between the former Austrian partition and the former Russian partition on this border between the central and southern Poland, but not on the border between the former Prussian partition and the Russian partition. We've been able to show also that there are three important norms towards education that are different between the former Austrian partition and these remaining territories of Poland. And the most pronounced one is refers to the trust towards education institutions. This is not entirely, I mean, this trust result is not entirely new in terms that similar research was done before, but by Becker team in 2016. It was not on education. It was on the general level of trust in the former under the former Habsburg rule, including Galicia, including this Austrian partition of Poland, and the level of the effect on the level of trust contemporary and the level of corruption. And they also found that this former territories under the Habsburg rule experienced a high level of trust in the public institutions in general and lower level of corruption. So this result, our result really corresponds with this one. Yeah, and it also confirms this suggestions that of Bukowski and also of myself with Anna Kaliszewska, that the differences that we are observing in the level of achievements between the historical regions can be explained by the norms towards education. And in more general sense, we get a confirmation that these long impulated norms have a impact on contemporary phenomena. And what I think is very important as a result of this research, that any measures that are aimed at coping with inequalities that rely on the distribution of resources, usually, may not be effective if they don't take into account the differences in norms. That any effective measures to cope with inequalities should take into account that students, but also parents, have different attitudes towards education, and maybe we have to address their beliefs and their behaviors differently in different historical regions. Finally, it is also important for us when we're judging the effectiveness of schools and evaluating schools, that sometimes schools are operating with very different conditions, not only because of the contemporary differences in levels of economic development, the money they get, but also because they face very different norms among their societies, among their students, teachers. So sometimes a very simple and compelling tools to evaluate their quality may not reveal truth about the reality they are functioning in, and may not be just. And that's all. Thank you very much.
Yes, please.
At the outset, I thought that you might be building a case for why different cultural norms resulted in differences in middle school math and science scores. Mm-hmm. But that's not what I see on your regression results. What I see is how differences in the regions have resulted in different cultural norms regarding education. So it still remains speculative as to why the math and science scores would be so different today. And I'm just wondering if you're going to go in that direction and look at those, or whether there were other kinds of, maybe perhaps humanities scores, social science scores, language, that you might look at Otherwise, I would suggest maybe different cultural norms produce a different emphasis on curriculum design.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so I think there might be a couple more, you know, pieces to the puzzle that you haven't addressed. I realize this is only a slice of your research program, but I wonder if you might elaborate a little bit more on those connections.
Sure. Of course, we looked at different tests. We only used math and science here because generally in this kind of quantitative research, it's considered as most reliable because of the nature of the test. Because the test of humanities is really yeah, you may suspect that there is much more, the standardized tests in humanities are less effective and they subject to more errors. But you can see this difference in humanities too. It's not that it's only limited to math and science tests. It's also in humanities.
Here's the follow-up. Do you think then that perhaps the different attitudes towards education, because kids are kids, but
Yeah.
and they're middle schoolers after all, the role of parents, if the parents have sort of inculcated these norms, they will stay on top of their students and encourage them to study hard and to do well and do their homework and to be polite and well-behaved in school. I was thinking that perhaps it operates through the parents.
That's how norms normally operate. Yeah, so it's they are inherited from the parents, and that is confirmed by these migration studies, yes, because that's how migrants preserve their norms, and they most often share the norms that are typical for the country or the region of their origin, rather than the one that they are settling right now. But it's so I would expect it that there are parents. We try to control different characteristics of parents, like education, of course, and their own migration experience.
Well, the only reason I went there was some 50 years ago, James Coleman at Harvard established that educational attainment in American schools is almost entirely dependent upon the family context, and in particular, the parental attitude towards educational achievement.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
the only reason I asked.
Yeah. This finding was then challenged many times, especially in this part when he claims that that school has no effect, like school resources. That is only parents and peers. I don't think that's true anymore as a general finding. But still, I think this mechanism that we are talking about here are mostly through parental effect.
So one of the things that we saw in the regression was that the average expected score on the Austrian-Russian border, for Austria, it climbed the closer that you got to that border. Was there any, while on the Russian side there wasn't really much difference at all, depending on the 50-kilometer difference from that border. Was there any kind of insight that you drew from that specifically? Why was it that higher score was expected the closer that you got to the border?
Yeah. So the idea is based on the assumption that that very close to the border, schools and towns, settlements are generally very similar to each other, and there are so the environment in which people live and go to school is very similar. So you really try to establish whether there is a jump in quality right at the border or not. And by jump, I mean that, because you can imagine that, like we observed, there is a line on the left side of the border, jump, and almost flat line, and this indicates that probably the border is the issue, because you can imagine that the average quality is higher at the right side of the border than the left side, but the line is really like this, increasing. So this would indicate that it's not the border that's an issue, but there are some factors that influence quality of education that are higher on average on the right side of the border, but they are also higher, more and more higher as we go farther from the border. Yes, so it's not really the cultural experience of the historical experience, but some other confounding factors. But here it was not the case. we observe the jump, because this regression discontinuity is really the regression of the average score on the distance from the border. So whether the distance plays the role. And the answer that we're going to get to confirm our hypothesis that it is the border that is a factor, is that no, there is no effect of the distance from the border. It's just the effect of the border itself. So there's a single jump at the border, and not the effect of the distance from the border on the quality of education. I'm not sure if this. Yeah.
I have a question about the question of poverty and development, right? Because Galician, Austrian partition was this strange phenomenon of an amazingly rich cultural life,
Yeah.
but at the same time, lower development, certainly lower than kind of a poverty level higher than in Prussian partition, and to some parts of the Russian partition. I don't know, I don't want to make now comparison, but I would say that it was, well, least industrialized, right? With just those two big urban centers, Krakow and Lviv. So I wonder to what extent that has something to do with the norms of education being a value in itself. That would be one of my questions. Another question is, it is fantastic that what we kind of think culturally, without all your wonderful statistical research, what we think culturally, namely that kind of local autonomy, local quasi-sovereignty that Poland had as a state in that region of Galicia that could still have this local autonomy, influenced educational norms. That's wonderful. But it was really interesting to me that local autonomy instruction in Polish happens in the most ethnically heterogeneous region of the Commonwealth before partitions, right? So at the same time, this region is, okay, so this, what I'm trying to say is that this region of Galicia is poorer than other regions. It is more ethnically heterogeneous than other regions, ethnically, religiously, all culturally, right? Those are the borderlands with Ukraine, with Belarus, with, right? So the question is like, what about these factors? Like, how can we maybe kind of like hook it to your research?
Yeah.
Can I just ask you one quick question that kind of fits into that a little bit? Because I'm thinking, of course, you know, it's all of the expectations. That defies what you showed us, defies all the expectations for the reasons that you listed. So it's, you said when compulsory education was introduced in Prussia and when it was introduced in Russia, when was it introduced in Austria, in Galicia?
In the middle, like it was 1867, I think. 1867, yeah. Of course, being introduced and being really like implemented is.
So when was it implemented?
It's difficult to say. I mean, in all three regions there was some level of illiteracy even in the early 20th century. So, but it was definitely highest in the Russian part. In the Russian part, it was the highest level of illiteracy.
Illiteracy.
Yeah. Okay, so I agree that it was surprising. This at least, especially this first map, yes, with the because we are used to in this geographical research in Poland that whatever indicator we put on the map, it's always best in the West, and we are used to prize the West and blame the
Poland B and Poland A,
yeah,
right?
There's this notion of Poland A and Poland B, and Poland A is always the West, but not in terms of education. So I think one factor that maybe we didn't call it a separate norm here, but that may be behind these norms is also what I'm surprised in, maybe this way, is that this returns to education show up to be lower in perceived like returns to education, lower in the Austrian partition.
And returns to education.
Because I
is
thought the
the
mechanism would be okay. We are poor, but education is for us the mean to get richer, yes, to get better developed. So we think it's
from education.
it should be very important for us to go to school to study, because that's the way us to catch up to the more developed regions. And it seems not to be the case. I mean, education is more perceived as a value for itself, yes, than as a factor, at least in declarations of the people, than as a factor of success in any measurable sense. And that's what really surprises me, because this notion of returns to education is clearly separated here from the notion of trust in education. We trust in education, but not because it gives us better life, yes, but because we think it's important as a formative. And this is surprising for me. Yeah,
so it is surprising to me as well, because that notion of self-betterment in my mind is inextricably connected with Bildung, which is a very Prussian concept. And you would think that it had resonances there as well, but there seems to be no differentiation of this sort.
But it also the social capital in that region kind of cultures, I don't know if this is the right way to use social capital, might have been conceived because of the poverty of the region in a different way than us, material status.
But then the same goes for Russia, so that doesn't solve the problem.
But anyway, it breaks the pattern in a sense that this kind of research is being done in different parts of the world, also for historical reasons, like Italy, the States, in Germany, and in most cases you would see a positive correlation between the economic development and the quality of education. But not in this case, and this is why it is so interesting. For me, the only exception that I know is that Eastern and Western Germany differences in PISA, which turns out to be, the PISA results turned out to be, at least in some editions, were higher in the eastern part of Germany than in the western part of Germany, which is also surprising. But it's, but I'm not sure if you can find an association between. But anywhere else, like in Italy, the north and southern division, in the States also north, south, and the coast versus the rest.
The economic maps.
Yeah, so it resembles the economic maps.
And how does it play out? Well, you did middle schools, right?
Yeah.
Universities, on the other hand, are very migratory institutions in a sense that, both Krakow and Warsaw, so Galician partition, Austrian partition and Russian partition, right? They accept students from all over, right? So would that norms towards education be different between those two universities or not? Considering that they have, mixed migratory education population, right? But we kind of know from knowing Polish culture that it's a very different aura and atmosphere in Krakow at the Jagiellonian and very different in Warsaw University, right? Like we see that the norms are different there, even though the population is all mixed up. So do you see some correlation between these research? I know you didn't do research, but if you were to kind of hypothesize, to project from what you did in middle schools and universities?
Frankly, I don't know. As you said, I didn't do research, but it gives me an idea, actually, that I could try to. Because I now work on the data from Warsaw University admission system. And I think it's a good idea to check, for example, whether the choice of fields is affected by this region of origin. because the University of Warsaw, being the biggest, largest university in Poland, attracts students from different regions. So maybe it's worth to investigate.
And still has this reputation of being more kind of investment-driven, right? Like more kind of a, not that it's a business school, but it's more a school for kind of aggressive students, right? While the Jagiellonian is that
I think it's
kind
not because of the
old-
university itself, but because it's in Warsaw.
Yeah, that's true.
It's like
Absolutely.
putting one step in Warsaw already.
Yes.
I wonder if there were significant differences in educational funding between those various regions.
No,
There
no,
were
no.
not.
At this level, and that's why also we focused on the level of middle schools, because up to upper secondary schools, the funding system is very uniform in Poland, and it consists of the state funding combined with the local government funding, but under the very strict rules.
I wonder then maybe an alternative explanation for the wealthiest parts or the most developed parts of Poland having some difficulty with middle school achievement might be explained by maybe a more casual attitude towards educational achievement, because no matter what you achieve, you're still going to live reasonably well.
Yeah.
You know. I'm just wondering if there isn't some attitudinal difference there.
I
that
think,
would
I
account
think it's
for it.
possible. I think it's a good path to try to understand better the attitudes in the West, maybe than only focusing on this Galicia. Because what I think maybe the factor is a historically established industrialization of the West, which causes that the choice of the vocational career is nothing bad. It's an alternative path of career that may yield a good result, good life, because there is industry, there's prospects of the career. While in this poor South, you either are academically good and it gives you a ticket to the better life, or not.
It's still. I was just thinking though, the effect might be weak unless you draw the boundaries a little differently, because then you'd have to look at the more industrialized portions of the country, which might transcend some of those historical boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's an interesting question. Frankly, I'm very, I can't say I'm surprised. I'm impressed that you found such a very strong difference with that long an echo of historical differences. It's really quite striking.
It's actually not, like for me, it's culturally not surprising, but that there is a kind of hard data that proves it. That is amazing. That is, like, I don't know how you feel.
No, I mean, all of the above. I think it's, on the one hand, it's striking, it defies the expectations because of the economic maps. On the other hand, I mean, I physically experienced the difference between the partitions when I'm in Poland, so, and I think we all do. But I have a question about the outcomes, not the outcomes, but the conclusions that you have reached. One of the points that you made that seems to translate into the trust in institutions has to do with a certain level of sovereignty, autonomy in terms of the educational system, and there is now more control from the center, even in terms of standardized testing. That's one thing. The other thing that you pointed out is that what might have nurtured this sense of trust in institutions is the presence of local teachers, the teachers from within. Is this still the case? Have you been able to follow up? Are the swoi teaching in the schools?
We try to control it. We try in different ways, because we try to control whether parents have associations with the school the kids are going to, like whether there are teachers that were teachers when who were teachers at the time when they were going to school, whether they go to the same schools the parents were going to. So we try to control that. I can be sure that I do all I can in a sense.
So,
but what we can see that Galicia is the difference between Galicia and the other regions is much lower level of mobility. So people are much more local schools.
So it's still
Yeah.
teachers who grew up in that
Yeah.
region coming
Yeah.
back.
Yeah.
So when you say we are trying to control, so you're trying to eliminate actually this kind of immediate loyalty to the school, because I went there and my
Yeah.
kid is going there and my grandkid will.
So I will,
yeah.
to now I will say only good things about the
Yeah,
school.
yeah, yeah. Wow, this is
This is great.
This
This
is
is
great.
fascinating.
We want more of this research for our own cultural research. Thank you so much, Mikołaj.
Thank you.